Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our class on ethics and science. Let me share my screen and start our PowerPoint, and we will get going. Pull up the PowerPoint, and okay, here we go. So I am not beginning this lecture or the next one with a joke because, look, the subject matter is pretty serious this week and last week, and it just didn't feel right. This week we are talking about Tuskegee and the syphilis experiments done there. Um, And let me start by saying, it's my disclaimer here. I am not the ideal person to deliver this history. I would encourage you to go look at voices who are more experts on this, who are a little closer to the bone here. Um, However, this is something that our textbook talks about at length. This was in the curriculum that I was handed by the University of North Texas, and we're going to talk about it, and I'm going to be as respectful as I can, knowing that I am not the authoritative voice on this, and that you should be listening to people who are a little bit more authoritative. And so I would encourage you to find those voices. Take what I say with a grain of salt, because I am privileged in ways that the people who participated in this study were not. And that should make my opinion a little bit suspect. Anyway, beginning. So, our reading on this, the one that really covers this by itself, is this piece by Dr. Alan Brandt, The Case of the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. And the main point here is the Tuskegee case reveals much more about the pathology of racism than it ever did about syphilis. And as we'll get into it, in fact, they didn't actually learn much about syphilis over this 30 some odd year study because all they did was prove the obvious. Anyway, so what was the Tuskegee syphilis study? It was a study on the effects of untreated syphilis in African American men with obvious results. If you don't treat a disease, it gets worse. Why was this unethical? Well, a lot of reasons. If one of the biggest principles in research on human subjects is informed consent, we can say without a doubt that the participants in this study were not given enough information to actually give informed consent. Biggest reason? They weren't told that they had syphilis. And this put participants in danger, and they were harmed by the researchers, sometimes directly harmed, other times indirectly harmed. For example, participants not only were they not told that they had syphilis, they were prevented from seeking treatment other places. Those who were drafted into the military, because again, this did take place between the 30s and 50s, so there were a couple of drafts in there. They were not that A memo was sent to the military saying, please don't tell these people they have syphilis and please don't treat them. And the military complied. So even after some of these participants became government employees, they were still not given the health care they needed. And other ways that they were directly harmed by researchers, one of the treatments that they were given was actually a spinal tap test, something designed to extract information from the human body by inserting a needle into the spine. Participants were told that this was a treatment, and that was a lie. It's an incredibly invasive and painful and dangerous procedure, and it did not benefit the participants at all. In fact, this entire study did not benefit a single participant, which, as we talked about last week, is something that is essential. The people you're studying need to benefit from the study you're doing. That didn't happen in this case. Researchers did not respect the dignity, rights, and humanity of the participants. And as we'll talk about, that is because there was explicit and implicit racism on the part of the researchers and the government agency conducting the experiments, and that continued up until, within a human lifetime from now. This study ended 49 years ago. My mom was alive then. Like, your grandparents were probably alive then. This is not ancient history. And look, participants died as a result of researchers' negligence. And in fact, negligence is probably too kind a word because, as we saw in some of the direct quotes from researchers here, they wanted to conduct autopsies on some of the research participants, meaning that they wanted some of their participants to die. So the deaths of those participants was not an accident, was not a circumstance, it was by design. And I would add here that in the research I've done on this, not a single person was actually punished. That should bother you. So, who is responsible? Yeah, outside of individual persons, the government agency who actually conducted these experiments was the United States Public Health Service. This is a branch of the government that is still around and operational today. They are, of course, quite a bit more reformed today than they were then. However, it is worth mentioning that this wing of the government still exists, still operates, often in impoverished places around our country. Some notable information here, and I think we've covered some of this already. Participants were not informed they had syphilis, they were prevented from seeking treatment. Some new stuff here. This was done fairly out in the open. Papers were published by the USPHS during the course of this study, meaning that there were scientific journals in which this information was made publicly available. However, over the course of 30 years in many published papers, nobody said anything up until the very end. We'll come back to that. Treatment was promised but never delivered on, and sometimes faked. It was actually in the agreement they had with the county that this study took place in, that people would be treated, even after penicillin was found to be the thing that would treat syphilis effectively. No one was ever given penicillin. People were given fake treatments. We talked about the spinal taps already, but they were also given things like mercurial ointment, which the researchers knew didn't do anything. It was a placebo, and not in the good control group kind of placebo way, because of course the placebo group does eventually receive treatment. That didn't happen in this case. Also, we should note here, and the researchers didn't know this at the time, but we know it now, mercurial ointment, which contains mercury is poison. So even the control group, which, even the control group was poisoned. This is an incredibly unethical thing, and it happened recently. So, what can we learn here? A couple things. And let's revisit this point of this was being published in journal articles, but nobody cared about it as an ethical issue until the media started reporting on it. So, one of the big questions of this section has been, can the scientific community police itself? And there are lots of things like the Mertonian norms or the Nuremberg codes or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all of which were written during the course of this study, but were not followed by anybody involved in this study. So science's ability to police itself did not seem to work in this particular case. Does that mean it doesn't work at all? Maybe not, but here we have to say that science did not police itself. Also, the scientists involved in these atrocities are not especially evil. And what I mean by that is they're no more evil than anybody else, really. And this comes back to our reading from Thomas Merton on Adolf Eichmann at the beginning of the semester, right? There's something banal about evil. These people were remarkably average as far as scientists go, and they were, by their own admission, motivated by some form of ethics, right? In fact, one of the researchers who's quoted in the paper we read talked about how he felt the people he was studying lacked virtue. So we can imply from that, at least, that he is aware of some form of ethical theory. Even so, he doesn't seem to follow that theory himself. You could make an argument that they had a consequentialist ethic governing their decision making, although even that is not likely, because if consequentialism deals with the greatest good to the greatest number and the least harm to the least number, well, it didn't seem like they were concerned with doing the least harm to the least number. They were hoping for the consequences of proving a point that untreated syphilis harms someone. That's an easy thing to prove, and it doesn't require 400 people over the course of 30 years. Still, the racist attitudes informed and motivated and justified the evil behavior of these researchers. And this, I would say, reveals both in explicit and implicit ethics or lack thereof rather, of the USPHS and science at large in the US at the time. And we can even say beyond science, just American society at the time. And we should question just how much things have changed over the last 49 years. We're not talking about present day, but that is a question to raise is look, this wasn't that long ago. How much have things changed since, and has it been enough? We're going to talk a little bit more about implicit and explicit stuff on the next slide because I think there's a good evaluative tool that I can give you. But what else can we learn here is look, one of the driving ideas of modern science and philosophy has been that scientific progress can and should lead to moral progress. And that has not been proven true over time. Um, I don't believe it was in the Carl Sagan videos we watched, but something he talks about is human evolution through the form of evolving mental states through science has led to moral progress. We don't do this or that thing anymore. And you can point to cases like Tuskegee and say, I'm not sure that we've become more moral. I think maybe we've just become more effective at being immoral. Um, that's not exactly my own personal view, but you could make that argument. And so we have to question, okay, how do we achieve moral progress? Because our scientific progress doesn't seem to be getting us there on its own. We need something else to help with that. That this is a case of science untethered from ethics, and we get unethical results from it. So let's talk about this evaluative tool. And I am stealing this from a scholar named Elliot Eisner. This book was written a couple of years ago, but it's pretty good. And he's talking specifically about education. But I think that this can be applied to lots of other situations. So you could find and replace curriculum for communication here and get the same thing out of evaluating philosophy, values, ethics. So he says there's three kinds of curriculum. And again, we would say communication. There's the explicit, which is what you say out loud, the implicit, which is what your actions show, and the null, which is what's missing, what you don't talk about, what you don't write about, and what's absence is noticeable. And so, looking at Tuskegee, what did they say out loud the purpose of the study was? To show the effects of untreated syphilis over a period of time. Okay. What was implicit? Well, their racist attitudes, the lack of concern for the human subjects, and the horrifying disregard for human dignity that went on through this whole process. That was what is implied by the Tuskegee experiment, whether or not the researchers knew it. What is missing? Care for the human, any sense of ethics or equality. And so, why does this matter? Well, because the people conducting these experiments believed that they were doing something good. And they were wrong about that. And we can't recognize what is implicit or null in our own work and practice without reflection and without discourse with other people. And with other people here, I mean specifically the people that are the participants in your research. Because if the people conducting this research, if this government agency had at all bothered to communicate the truth of what they were doing to these participants, to let participants know that they had a disease that was treatable, they could have heard from those participants that they would like to be treated for that disease. And you could have had a much different study as a result. You would have had better science if they had communicated with these people, and you would have avoided all of these ethical problems. But that didn't happen. And so now this serves as a case of this is one of the most unethical pieces of science done on American soil. And remembering that we've talked about several other unethical pieces of science done on American soil already. Moving on. So, what can we learn here? First, and this is something I want to address because I've done research on it before, and our article doesn't talk about it all that well, is that this study and the racist attitudes toward public health that motivated it, these were not isolated incidents in American history. On this, I would point to TB cases in Chicago in the 1930s. There's a really good book, good as in well written. Subject matter is quite depressing, but better to know than not know, by a scholar named Jacob R. Grossman, where he's talking about, it's really a history of Black communities in Chicago. And something that he points out in there, and I've got a paper on this if you would like to read it, email me and I'll send it to you, is that the uh, the establishment at the time scapegoated these Black communities as having diseases. And so they were pushed into smaller and smaller places to live, which had poor ventilation, poor access to public health, poor access to medicine, doctors, and were actually quite polluted by no fault of the people living there. They were forced to live in these places. And so, of course, people got sick. And in Chicago in the 30s, tuberculosis was the disease that spread there. And so this scapegoating became a self-fulfilling prophecy, which then led to the justification of worse segregation. It's pretty insidious. It's an awful thing that happened. And even today, and this is coming from Dr. Robert Bullard, his book Dumping in Dixie, which again is fantastically well researched, depressing subject matter, but worth the read, is that today Black and brown communities still bear the greatest burden in terms of pollution, environmental health hazards, and lack of access to healthcare. Towards the beginning of COVID, people's ability to breathe was kind of on the mind. It was in those first 2 weeks of lockdowns. There was a neighborhood in Chicago where a coal power plant was demolished during the first week of lockdowns, spreading clouds of ash over the entire neighborhood, making it harder for people to breathe in the middle of a pandemic. I have to say that these things have not gotten much better. And so I've got it at the bottom here, but this unfounded fear of disease was a rationale for segregation, which led to outbreaks of disease by no fault of the people who were being segregated. Definitely on the fault of the people in power who were pushing folks into smaller and smaller neighborhoods. So let's continue with reflections and connections with previous readings and previous ideas. Like I said earlier, this is not ancient history. The Tuskegee experiments ended 49 years ago, 1972. That is within a human lifetime. So we can't exactly approach this as, oh, that happened, but we've progressed so much since then. Because there are people for whom this is in their living memory. And science is often presented as above moral inquiry, always morally good, but cases like this show just how dangerous assumptions like that can be. That if the scientists in question had bothered to think about the ethical implications of their work, that would really have changed what was done, but they didn't bother to think about it. A bigger question, and one that's incredibly relevant right now, is there is a reason for a healthy distrust of power in the case of the sciences. And this poses a problem for us, right? How does science earn trust in times of crisis? Knowing that there are communities that have historically been abused by scientists, how do scientists today gain the trust of those communities for things like vaccines? And that is not an easy question to ask. It's not one that I think there's a clean answer to. And yet, it is something that needs to be engaged with for the health of those communities. But how do you gain that trust? I'm not the right person to give an answer to that one. Lots of systems have been set up to prevent this kind of large-scale misconduct in the years since, but are they enough? Getting out of the PowerPoint for a second, I have an article from the CDC about Tuskegee and how it changed research practices. And I'd encourage you to look at all this. They would say, look, all these ethics groups were established after we had this study. We've changed. And I don't know. I poke around on here. I'm going to put the link in our Canvas page like I always do. But there's something about that I'm not sure if it's enough. And maybe it is. You're free to disagree with me on that one. Then the problems revealed in Tuskegee go beyond informed consent, fraud, falsification, and plagiarism. And they really go past science alone. And so this definition of FFP, for scientific misconduct, human rights abuses kind of go past fraud. Like you could argue that, yeah, there was some form of fraud in the case of not telling people they had a disease, but also letting folks die so that you can dissect their bodies might go a little bit further past this narrow definition. And so, how do we build better definitions of these things to prevent atrocities? Because that is a real possibility. And like we've talked about with this class, some of that stuff's already ongoing. Now, are current scientific abuses happening on the part of governments? Not so much anymore, at least not in America. But private enterprise is still going for it. And so, how do we stop that? And then another thing that I was wondering about in reading this and in some other stuff I've been reading lately is modern science is built on the idea of knowledge as foundational. That if you just establish, the basis of truth, you can build on that and then you don't have to go back and question yourself. But might it be better to think of knowledge as self-correcting? And if you're curious about this, I can provide some sources from other scholars. Cornel West has a pretty good book on this. Well, he talks about it in one of his other books, where he writes about how self-correcting knowledge might work a little bit better because then you can go back and not undo, but correct the mistakes that were done in the past. But if knowledge is foundational and you just build on it and you have a perfect foundation of knowledge, you don't self-correct, which might give some reason to why correction is not something that is encouraged in the scientific community, but I'm not sure. And this is actually where I'm going to leave you for this lecture because we're going to talk about some other things in the next one. And hopefully a more hopeful case in the next lecture. I'm going to pause this one. I'm going to go record that one. And I will see you all whenever it is that you click on the next video. Information on the discussion post will be in that one. And I will see you all soon.